Today we are here to treat or look at the issue of polarization in Europe, but not only. What are the causes of such polarization? What are the causes and remedies? And what can we do about this big problem? Because clearly polarization has become one of the most important problems in Europe nowadays, at least in terms of party politics. Never before polarization was as high. As you can see in this table that summarizes or looks at the level of support for anti-political establishment parties, meaning populist, extreme, anti-systemic, illiberal political parties. The level of support has never, as I was saying, been as high in the whole history of Europe since the beginning of the 20th century, to the point that around 1/5 of the electorate nowadays supports electorally this kind of anti-political establishment parties. And this is a trend that we can see not just in the new democracies of Eastern Europe, but also especially in Southern Europe. As you can see here in this table, after the Great Recession, the level of support for this type of populist anti-establishment parties was higher than ever, but also among the most consolidated democracies of Western Europe. The thing is this really a problem? Is this really a cancer of democracy? Is this really leading to the decline on the quality of democracy and the collapse of our democracies? It may well be that at least within the European Union, only Hungary has become non-democratic, but clearly there is a link between support and voting for populist parties and establishment parties and the quality of democracy. In a study that I published in the Representation Journal with a colleague from the Autonomous University of Madrid, José Rama, in 2020, we show that there is a clear negative and significant relationship between support for anti-political establishment parties and the quality of democracy. You can see here that it doesn't matter if we look at Western Europe or at Eastern Europe. The more support for anti-establishment parties, the more support for populist, illiberal, anti-systemic parties, the lower the quality of democracy is. In fact, it does not even matter if we look at different dimensions on the quality of democracy. Here, using BDEM Institute data, we distinguish the effect of supporting for anti-establishment political parties and different dimensions of democracy: electoral democracy, liberal democracy, deliberative democracy, participatory and egalitarian democracy. Of course, the first might be, different, but they all point to a clear conclusion. Support for populist, illiberal, anti-systemic, anti-establishment parties leads to lower quality of democracy. Doesn't matter the dimension we look at. So the thing is, yes, we have a problem. As I mentioned, nobody people voted for anti-democratic, at least against liberal democracy parties than ever before. We know that this has important negative consequences for the quality of democracy. The question is, what is causing this problem? Only by understanding what causes the problem, we can try to find solutions to the problem. When we look at the literature, we see, of course, that economy has been considered to be one of the problems one of the issues, that leads to the increase in the level of support for anti-political establishment parties. There is this idea that when people are having a hard time, they will be more, their attention will be more captured by those parties that offer simple solutions to what are really complex problems. Which are those parties? Populist parties and establishment parties. Others think that it is at the core of political parties themselves where the problem is, meaning that it is the crisis of mainstream traditional political parties that has led to the increase of support of populist anti-establishment parties. There is this idea that political parties do not represent us anymore, that they have stopped mobilizing the electorate, that there has been a mutual withdrawal of political parties and voters from the electoral arena, Clearly, we know that, for example, people go to vote less, people vote for different parties every time that go to vote. And, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, clearly they vote for those parties that are less democratic. And this is because mainstream parties have been called public utilities. They have become entrenched in the state. They have become representative of the state rather than representative of the voters. And of course, voters have opted for a different option, which are those of populist parties that consider themselves to be the representative of the people, the representative of their interest. There is a third school of thought that considers that it is social change that has led to the increase in the level of support for anti-establishment political parties. There is this idea that, cleavages are fading away, that, the process of globalization and secularization have eliminated the class cleavage and the religious cleavage that tend to determine the way political parties relate and voters vote. And this is why new parties are needed to represent these new sectors of society and these new interests among voters. Finally, of course, it is the idea that the Great Recession, the 2008 crisis, came to destroy the stability of European party systems, not only, and of course led to a social, political, not only economic and financial crisis that blew up the stability of the systems and opened the space for these populist anti-political establishment parties to attract the elect. In another study that I published at the European Political Science Review with my colleague Jose Rama in 2020, we look at this issue. We control for different factors, and there we find that economy is not what has been determining, the increase in support for anti-establishment parties, but rather the crisis of political parties and changes within society. We use fragmentation, the effective number of electoral parties, to really capture the crisis of parties, the idea that, the more the parties in the system, the more the number of new parties in the system clearly captures the crisis of mainstream political parties. And on the other hand, we use the traditional pedestals of electoral volatility to look at, changes in the electoral preference that are determined by changes in society. We, as I mentioned, control for the factors, sociological factors, institutional factors, even the age of democracy, and we clearly see that it is the increase in the level of fragmentation and increase in volatility, meaning the increase in the crisis of political parties per se, and this cultural change that has led, as you can see clearly in these graphs, to an increase in the level of support for anti-political establishment parties. Moreover, and we test also the theory about, the big crisis, the Great Recession. We look even at the effects of another important economic crisis, the Great Depression in 1920. We find that the Great Depression did not have an effect in the level of support for anti-establishment parties. The 2008 Great Recession, as you can see in this graph, acted not so much as a cause per se of the increase in support for anti-political establishment parties, but as a trigger, as a fuel to the fire of the crisis of parties and social change. We see in this graph on the left that before the Great Recession, there was already an increase in the fragmentation of European party systems. Now, of course, there was already the crisis of political parties can be dated, even, before the 21st century. But it is only after the Great Recession that this crisis becomes, more important, and of course leads, as we know, to the increase in the level of support for anti-establishment parties. And the same we can see on the right graph, where there is a bit of an increase in electoral volatility before the Great Recession, but it simply explodes after the Great Recession, leading, of course, to the increasing support of anti-political establishment parties. So it is not so much the cause, but a complement to what are the main causes of the increasing support for anti-establishment parties, the increasing polarization, which is the crisis of political parties and social change. So now that we know what are the causes of the increasing support for anti-establishment parties, we can say that in reality, the rising support for anti-establishment liberal parties is not the cancer, is not the sickness. It is the symptom. It is the symptom of a more important problem, which is the crisis of mainstream political. So polarization is due to the crisis of traditional political parties. And it is here where I'm going to propose, a possible solution to the problem, before, of course, analyzing some of the solutions that other scholars have suggested before me. Following this medical metaphor, let's imagine that we are surgeons, that we need to treat a very important sickness, the cancer of political parties. So what do surgeons do? They, in case of cancer, remove the tumors, remove those parties, in our case, that are problematic for democracy. We know, as you could see, that the level of support for the political establishment parties is related to, of course, the low quality of democracy in our European country. So in our case, extirpation, the surgery, could be the prohibition and the banning of anti-political establishment parties. Here we have, some, of course, let's say, ethical, moral issues. Should a democracy ban political parties? We have even a legal issue. Should political parties, can political parties be banned? The European Constitution of Human Rights jurisprudence says that only as a final solution, only as a, last measure to defend democracy, can parties be banned. People are in favor of banning political parties, as the studies have shown. But the problem is that for a prohibition of parties to be effective, it needs to last for some time. If it is lifted after a couple of years, it will not work. When we look at history, we see successful cases of banning of political parties. For example, in Germany, in the 50s, the Communist Party and the Neo-Nazi Party were banned, and we know that, political parties flourished and democracy consolidated in Germany. Similar in Finland in the 30s when the Lapo movement was banned. But for example, Turkey is one of the countries that have banned most political parties in Europe. 15 between 1945 and 2017. And nowadays, Turkey is an illiberal democracy. The same we can say in the case of the Basque country, where the banning of Batasuna was lifted after certain years, and the party system is now going to change and the level of polarization has increased. The second measure that a surgeon would recommend for cancer is chemotherapy. In our language, political science would be the famous cordon sanitaire, as the French call it, the discrimination of populist in liberal parties. The problem here, once again, is that we need to keep this discrimination over time. We need to apply it, to different, levels. So if we do it for just a couple of years and then we do not discriminate it. If we do it at the national level but we don't do it at the local level, at the end, it will not work. Moreover, the discrimination will just play in the discourse of populist parties, because if traditional parties discriminate populist parties, they will become an outsider. So they will simply confirm the typical discourse of populist anti-establishment parties, that they are the real representation of the people, that they are the outsiders, that the corrupt elites are taking and are discriminating, are eliminating from access to power. So they will become martyrs, and we know martyrs are popular, and this discrimination would only lead to increase the level of support for anti-establishment parties. When we look into history, we see, of course, cases where the cordon sanitaire work. Think of Czechoslovakia in the interwar period, the only Eastern European democracy that survived we had the famous Penca, 5 parties in the middle of the political spectrum, socialists, the nationalists, the liberals, the agrarians, and the conservatives, that they will always colligate together, discriminating the communists on the left and the Nazis on the right. In Italy, during the so-called First Republic, similar thing with the discrimination of the communists on the left and the neo-fascists on the right. These two democracies consolidated, these two democracies, we can say, that managed to survive. But for example, we have cases, like in France, where the cordon sanitaire clearly didn't work. The cordon sanitaire was, exercised or employed to discriminate the Front National. Most probably in the next elections, Le Pen will win, or at least has had a clear chance to win the presidential elections. The same we could say with the Flemish party in Belgium. The third possible solution is that of a hormone therapy. In our language, it would be the reconciliation, this idea that you cannot beat them, join them. You could do it by incorporating the policies of the populists, like the Conservative Party with Brexit, or by forming a coalition with them, like in Spain. The problem is that, this will not lead, as some scholars have, stated, to the moderation of the populist anti-establishment parties, but to the radicalization of the mainstream parties, as has happened with the Conservative Party in the United Kingdom or the Socialist Party in Spain, which now governs with populists, communists, separatists, and former terrorists. In cases of success, we have, for example, in Italy, when Berlusconi tried to bring, into the Casa di Popolo, the Alleanza Nazionale, the radical party that led to Finnish party disappearance. We have had also in Ukraine, when Svoboda was incorporated into the coalition and disappeared. But of course, we have cases where this was not the case. Italy itself, now, Brothers of Italy, considered a radical right party in government, and needless to say, Poland, where the coalition government of Law and Justice in 2005 with two populist parties, Self-Defense and the League of Polish Families, led to the situation that we had from 2015 until the recent elections, where peace moved to the right, becoming a radical right populist party and undermining the quality of democracy, as we know it happens every time that the level of support for radical right parties, so radical left, anti-political establishment parties in general, it will lead in terms of the level of democracy. The final and the solution that I propose is that of regeneration, a kind of stem cell therapy, the diet of political parties, which could consist of different elements. These are, of course, not the only ones. There are many others that we could consider. The first one is that important that political parties invest in their institutionalization, in their organization. Political parties have, especially mainstream parties, have forgotten how important it is to have strong organizations, how important is certain type of traditional campaigns, door to door. It is important that political parties do not think that they can win elections with just a tweet. It is important that political parties invest, as I said, in their institutionalization. Of course, they should be more responsive. If you want to attract, or at least reconquer, the political trust, the trust of your voters, you need to be responsive and you need to apply your programs. What you cannot do is to go to an election saying that you're going to decrease the taxes, and the first thing that you do after, of course, winning elections is to increase them. They have to be responsible. It is very important that political parties, for example, that are affected by corrupt politicians, expel those politicians until the problem is being solved. It is important that political parties are also responsible in the sense of they do not have to follow into the outbidding techniques of populist parties that promise the moon, to everybody. Traditional mainstream parties need to know what is possible and what is not, and they have to stop promising things that they cannot deliver in order to deceive their voters. It is essential also that political parties are transparent in terms of the decision-making, in terms of selection of leaders, but of course in terms of their financing. one of the heavy horses of populist parties, the way that they have managed to win elections and get into government is by attacking mainstream parties for being corrupt. That's why it's so important that mainstream parties establish rules for the financial transparency of their organization. They need to lead by example. I already mentioned this. It is very important that, of course, they use their role in society to educate voters. I think that, the educative function of political parties has been forgotten. But it is also important that they establish long-term, policies and perspective. It's not about the next, television show. It's not the next interview. It's not about the next tweet. It is important that, these long-term perspectives are, considered. That there are compromises between mainstream parties. There are certain topics that should be compromised, that they should reach a negotiational compromise, like, for example, the pension system, immigration, education. It is not good when every time that there is a new government, the education law is changed. And finally, and most importantly perhaps, we need that mainstream parties do not fall for the catch of populist and establishment parties that consider that democracy is a zero-sum game, that they are the only representatives of the people, that the only ones that are legitimized to be in government. Mainstream parties need to understand that alternation is at the core of representative democracy. So they shouldn't try to change institutions. They shouldn't try to cut freedom, media freedom, and other possible changes in order to avoid the opposition to come to government. Because at the end of the day, one day they will be also in opposition, and they would like to be treated fairly. And that's why democracy is not a zero-sum game. So, using once again the metaphorical, expression, we can say that we should not fall into the denial of polarization and the rise of populism. Because at the end of the day, what we would do is to ban these political parties. And we see that, banning does not work. We shouldn't get angry even with them and discriminate them, because we see that the cordon sanitaire doesn't work. We should also not bargain with them, neither in terms of accepting their policies and ideas, nor even into incorporated into coalition governments, because we saw that it doesn't work. We all know, we have read the news, we have, of course, read, academic scholarship. We are in this age of depression. We don't know what to do. We know that we have a problem, but we don't know how to solve it. I think that, we need to accept that we have a problem. We need to understand why we have a problem, and only then we can, apply the necessary, solution. So in conclusion, we have a problem. We all know about it. The problem of populism, the problem of the rise of anti-political establishment party. We have a cause, among others, the crisis of traditional political parties, the crisis of mainstream parties. But I think that, like Bolt the Builder, political parties also have the possibility, the inner power and potential to come with a solution to the problem, because they are the problem. And therefore, if they regenerate themselves, if they reform and change according to some of the issues that I mentioned in this presentation, democracy will be safe and the quality of democracy will be higher and polarization. Thank you very much.